right. Hello, everyone. It is 12:10, so Berkeley time, we can begin. So it is a very great pleasure today to welcome Jathan Sadowski here at the Berkeley Economy and Society Initiative, also known as BESI. I am Marion Fourcade from Sociology. We are part, and me and Desiree Field, who should be here any minute from Geography, we are part of a group of faculty running the technology cluster of BESI. And so when Desiree and I first brainstormed to discuss whom we wanted to have as a speaker, Jathan's name immediately came to mind. So we invited him to visit us, and we are lucky that he was willing to make the small trek from Australia. And he's already been around for nearly 2 weeks, and we've had a blast. So Jathan Sadowski is a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Information Technology at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. He received his PhD in STS from Arizona State University in 2016. That was not so long ago, if you think about it, but he's already the author of 2 books about technology and capitalism. Too Smart, his first book, came out from MIT Press in 2020. And today we are here to hear about The Mechanic and the Luddite, just published by UC Press. The Mechanic and the Luddite both offers, and I quote, a ruthless criticism of the new platform-dominated social order, but it also advocates for a radical politics of refusal. Jathan is a consummate interdisciplinarian. He has also, in addition to the books, an incredibly long list of highly influential papers in STS, urban studies, media studies, geography, and more. His name has come to be associated with a number of important concepts, such as Potemkin AI, data capital, and platform rentierism, among others. The subject of his third book, which he's already hard at work on, is the technopolitics of the insurance industry and more generally, the governance of risk in today's economy. And of course, last but not least, and that may be also one reason why you know him, Jathan co-hosts the podcast This Machine Kills, which is a must listen to for anyone working on the political economy of information technology. So without further ado, Jathan, welcome, and we'll look forward to the talk.
Hey. Yeah. Great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, BESI, for inviting me out. Thank you, Marion, for the too generous introduction. And of course, any TMK listeners would also know that my co-host Edward Anguessa Jr. is here in the front row as well. Happen to be in the Bay Area at the same time, so very exciting. But yes, I'm really happy to be here, talk to so many people. I'm so glad the atmospheric river that we're all being drowned in right now did not keep a room full of faces away, because I really want to get into the concepts that are orienting my new book, which I also just last week launched at City Lights, and that was very fun. And so I really felt like I needed to come to not just being the book published by UC Press, but being about technology and capitalism. I knew I needed to come to the belly of the beast to launch the book in the best way possible. And before I get going as well, I should also give a big shout out that the image up here was created by Earth Liberation Studio, which is a anarchist art collective based in LA that does a lot of really amazing art around eco-socialism and so on, but also lately, like everybody it seems, has been really turning their focus towards technology, towards AI, and what it means for a society. And so when I was looking for some images to really represent the talk, I found that, and I just knew it was perfect. So I will get started then. So, as a social scientist, I'm often asked how I ended up studying technology. to such a great degree that I'm now based in a Department of Human-Centered Computing and a Faculty of Information Technology, surrounded by many more data scientists and software engineers than social scientists and humanities scholars. You know, did I turn a hobby as a geek into a profession as a nerd, and then things kind of got carried away from there? Not quite, but also not wrong. No, in response to that question, I always answer truthfully, which is that technology is not actually what I study. It's not even really what I care about, at least not for its own sake. Instead, I'm far more interested in the material operations of power and the forms it takes in society. I'm interested in the social systems that govern our lives across different scales, from the everyday to the structural. And it's long been clear to me that technology is one of the most important vectors of power today. And here we can think of technology as, you know, a range of things, as specific devices, as a massive industry, as an influential ideology, or, as I'm prone to do in my own work, as a system of systems that cuts across these different scales and spheres in society. The idea that technology is power materialized is not a new development or a new idea in society, but it is a feature that continues to grow in both familiar and strange ways. It's also one that many people, including those who study and make and procure technology, are only really starting to recognize and confront. Being fascinated by technology for its own sake is perfectly fine. There's nothing inherently wrong with liking gadgets, and I have my own fair share of devices that I really quite enjoy and care far too much about. But the problem comes when we fetishize technology by only seeing the object in front of us or the promises sold to us without considering any of the broader networks of social, political, and economic relationships that the object is embedded within and emerges from. It's these relations that dictate everything about the actual existence materially of any technology, or the non-existence of alternative possibilities. In an abstract sense, all technologies are ultimately products of people. They give concrete form to human values and material structure to social relations. However, in reality, very few people actually have a hand in the production of technology. Only a tiny elite minority have the social power and the financial resources required to make real concrete decisions about a system's purpose or design. For everybody else, and that's all of us in the room today, technology is largely something that happens to us, not by us or with us or even for us, at least not primarily or directly. We largely have to live with the major choices made by a few. We might benefit from some of those things that happen to us while being harmed by other things, but we aren't really given a choice in those trade-offs. We have to figure out how to navigate the world they build, someone else builds, and the worlds they want to build. Relatively few people, again, get to exercise their influence and realize their visions. The rest of us don't really have that ability or that opportunity. Importantly, this is not because that's the only way things could possibly be. It's not because only an elite group has the knowledge, imagination, and ambition to make those choices. It's not because everybody else would just mess things up if they were given the chance. Rather, it's because this is how the political economy of technology is currently structured and perpetuated, materially and ideologically. These points about technology and power are today most apparent and perhaps most consequential with the exploding industry around artificial intelligence. According to a recent report by Goldman Sachs, quote, "The promise of generative AI technology to transform companies, industries, and societies continues to be touted, leading tech giants, other companies, and utilities to spend an estimated $1 trillion on capital expenditure in coming years, including significant investments in data centers, microchips, other AI infrastructure, and the power grid." Now, that report was written months before we heard Project Stargate be announced, with Trump and Larry Ellison and Sam Altman and Masayoshi Son standing together saying, we're going to find $500 billion in the couch cushions and create brand new, AI infrastructures and so on. So we might consider then that Goldman Sachs was conservative in their estimations of how much money is being invested in the real hard material infrastructure needed to support these ideological visions of AI and the industry built around it. And importantly, this $1 trillion investment in infrastructure for AI does not include the operational expenditure required to actually run these AI systems, which is where most of the medium-term financial cost and carbon emissions actually come from. For example, OpenAI, the maker of ChatGPT, I don't think I have to say that in this room, but I'll throw it in there in case, reportedly spends $700,000 a day to operate ChatGPT. At the same time, recent investigations have shown that companies like Google and Microsoft have blown past their sustainability commitments last year because of the huge spike in their carbon footprint from training and running AI models. This Goldman Sachs report is specifically talking about AI systems like chatbots, think ChatGPT, and image creators, think DALL-E and Midjourney, which are increasingly being integrated across more institutions and industries as tech companies try to find sources of revenue from AI by any means necessary. And a lot of this talk will focus on these generative AI, but we should of course say that that is by no means the extent of the AI industry, right? We can think of predictive AI systems and optimization AI systems, right? Systems that are designed to do other things than just generate text or images that have long existed well before generative AI was an apple in anybody's eye. But I think this talk will largely talk about AI broadly while bringing in generative AI as a bit more of a concrete example. So the reasons then for this enthusiastic early adoption are mostly hypothetical, with an emphasis on the hype. The promise of AI is simply put that it will be a universal solution for all problems. Whatever the issue might be, whether it's the desire for endless growth and infinite profit, or its dangers like climate change and cancer, AI will eventually, if given enough time and resources, devise the perfect solutions for these wicked problems. Meanwhile, in reality, we see report after report showing that these types of AI systems perform very poorly at the jobs they are meant to be enhancing or even replacing. They cost a lot of money to use, they create more work for people, and they produce low-quality outcomes. However, these actual impediments to the promise of AI don't stand a chance against the fire hose of cash and the ideology of innovation that pushes AI forward. The only real threat to AI is the public's lack of faith, trust, and acceptance. For us academics, this is now most apparent in our workplaces as universities fully embrace AI, treating it like an inevitable force which cannot be resisted or rejected. Instead, the best we can do is responsibly adopt these innovations according to the proper AI readiness frameworks and risk assessments. For example, my own university, Monash in Melbourne, Australia, which is the largest university in Australia and a leading research university at that, has recently given every staff and student a license for Microsoft Copilot, which is a generative AI companion for writing and research that's built on OpenAI's GPT-4 model. Access to Copilot is part of Monash's commitment to, quote, encourage the use of AI to innovate the way we work and create efficiency. And along with procuring this technology, Monash has also created an extraordinarily complex and convoluted suite of AI operations policies, AI strategy and governance, AI readiness frameworks, and a steering committee with subcommittees. To the university's credit, they created this whole infrastructure of governance very quickly, which shows that the central administration can act fast and devote resources to projects that might benefit their own interest, such as the reputational value of being seen as an early but responsible adopter of emerging technologies, despite its many known impacts and uncertain consequences. At the same time, these governance policies and strategies were developed in ways that parallel the development of AI. That is to say, they were created by a closed elite group at the top of a hierarchical financial institution. To say as a side note, I tried to see who was on the AI governance committee for Monash, and it was not public information. So I could see who the committee chair was, which was the chief data officer for Monash, but nobody who populated the committees. The development parallels, again, that is based on little to no consultation with the public, and then suddenly thrusted upon everybody else, who are told they should now use these technologies in their daily lives and follow these principles when doing so, in order to create maximum value for the institutions who built and procured the technology. And I've heard from colleagues that many other universities in Australia, the US, and Europe have been treating AI with similar levels of enthusiasm as Monash. It's not a surprise, then, that the neoliberal university would embrace a technology like artificial intelligence, which is purpose-built, as the author Ted Chiang notes, to become like a new McKinsey. That is, a system of optimization which further concentrates wealth and power for an elite group by maximizing their extraction of value and minimizing the rights of everybody else. Chiang is right when he says that AI, quote, sharpens the knife blade of capitalism. And he's also right when he observed in an interview from 2021 that, quote, most of our fears or anxieties about technology are best understood as fears or anxiety about how capitalism will use technology against us. And technology and capitalism have been so closely intertwined that it's hard to distinguish the two. So in my new book, I take that basic thesis and offer an expanded material analysis of how capital forges the technologies it then wields against us. For the rest of this talk, then, I'll hone in on that broad analysis by outlining 3 key concepts that are crucial for understanding and critiquing the political economy of AI and capitalism. First is innovation realism, which focuses on the financial and ideological investment into AI. Second is cheap data, which focuses on the technical construction of AI. And third is the perpetual value machine, which focuses on the purposes and uses of AI. So to understand the purpose of technologies like AI, we must turn our critical sights on the underlying financial system that structures technological design according to specific parameters to achieve certain goals. This Silicon Valley model of innovation, which has long been exported worldwide and held up as the gold standard that every other institution hopes to emulate, is a model in which venture capitalists operate like a powerful form of private planning for technology. Rather than resulting in the best innovations that benefit the most people or tackle the biggest problems, we are sold technologies that prioritize the financial interests and social values of a small pool of investors and corporations. We should debunk the idea that venture capitalists like the billionaires Mark Andreessen and Peter Thiel are brave risk takers who hold divining rods that allow them to find the best innovations, which are hidden from everybody else. Without venture capitalists, the global innovation landscape would look drastically different. VCs are powerful gatekeepers to capital, guarding its flows and deciding who gets access. This intermediary position gives them a crucial form of structural power over tech companies. They control the purse strings for entrepreneurs. And as political economist Franziska Kooijman observes in her great work on venture capital, quote, there is no alternative way for startups to obtain comparable amounts of capital. And this also then gives VCs the ability to ensure the digital economy follows their logics and serves their needs, with the most important being what Kooijman calls the hyper-growth principle. And this is more than a logic of profit maximization. Hypergrowth is based on selecting startups, technologies, and business models that can scale exponentially in a very short period with the potential to dominate their market. Let's go over the basics then. We hear a lot about venture capital, but I think it's worth digging into how it's actually structured. How does it work? So venture capital is based on partnerships. The general partners in a firm are active investors who decide where to invest money, where to send it. And how they actually make these decisions is something I'll discuss more a little later on. They manage those investments through building relationships with the entrepreneurs and providing guidance to the businesses where they invest money. These general partners are the people we know of as VCs. Then there are the limited partners in a firm, which are the capital providers. They are usually big institutional investors that have giant pools of money that they want to grow further, with the biggest and most important examples being pension funds and university endowments. The majority of money that VCs invest come from these two institutions, pensions and universities. VCs typically raise money in 10-year cycles. Over that time period, VCs will be expected to invest all the capital into promising tech companies and generate profits that will be returned to the limited partners, usually by guiding those startups into scaling up quickly, capturing as much of the market as possible, and either going public through a stock offering or being acquired by another tech company. VCs take an annual management fee plus around 20% of total investment profits. So there's very little actual risk for VCs beyond their reputation, since they will always get their base management fee plus a hefty percentage of any profits on top of that. And the VC model of innovation has become absolutely dominant, especially over the last 15 years, since the 2008 financial crisis, thanks in large part to the zero interest rate policy of many central banks, which made credit cheap and easy to access. And as the economist Robin Klingler-Vidra notes, quote, venture capital funding is increasingly seen as a substitute for other forms of research and development, other forms of research and development spending that are in decline, especially research directly funded by governments. In other words, government agencies and universities, which might have a mandate to deliver public goods like sustainable transportation or tackle societal problems like growing inequality, are now surrendering those decisions and that capital about which innovations are valuable and which problems should be solved to private financial markets. Let's put some numbers to venture capital. In 2021, in the midst of the pandemic, the VC industry broke its records for fundraising with more than 128 billion US dollars raised across 700 VC funds. This amount of new money was added to an already existing all-time high of more than $220 billion of dry powder, which is VC terminology for money that's been raised but not yet deployed. So in total, VC firms invested nearly $330 billion in 2021 alone. And this amount of money is mind-boggling. The level of investment here is incomprehensible. But it also raises a crucial question. What do we have to show for it? Where is the $330 billion of technological innovation, social progress, and human flourishing? Does the world today feel $330 billion better than it was before 2021? Or does it somehow feel worse? The central role that VC occupies in the innovation system has been the result of a number of self-reinforcing factors. In addition to the unbelievable amount of passive capital funneled into the VC industry through pensions, universities, and other institutional investors, these factors also include a tremendous amount of government support via subsidies, tax cuts, and favorable regulation. Venture capital now dominates our cultural ideas of how innovation can and should happen. And this has created a version of what I call innovation realism, riffing here on Mark Fisher's concept of capitalist realism. Or as he writes, quote, the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is now impossible to even imagine a coherent alternative to it. So here then, the idea is that VC is the only viable way to support innovation. And it's impossible to imagine, let alone implement other alternative methods of investing in or envisioning technology. This self-serving view is, of course, often expressed by the investors and entrepreneurs who benefit from it, but the ideology of innovation realism has also become ubiquitous elsewhere. It is a form of unquestioned common sense that is now asserted by everybody from policymakers to vice chancellors and everybody in between, right? Silicon Valley is no longer just an innovative place with a bunch of tech companies. It's now treated as the central innovation system for the whole global economy. We can see now with the Trump administration, it's also treated as the central governance system for the whole global political system. So with that then, I think we now have a good sense of how the financial system that structures and supports technology works. Now let's look closer at how the AI sausage is actually made. In their book, A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, Raj Patel and Jason Moore show how the continual expansion of capitalism has always relied on these necessary resources in different forms: nature, money, work, care, food, energy, and lives. But more than just access, capital needs to maintain control over these things in order to then keep them artificially cheap in a process where the social value of something like nature or care is overridden by their economic value, as they are thrown at the mercy of the market, turned into assets, subjected to dynamics of exchange, and burned in the engine of profit. To be more concrete about that, for example, the wealth of colonial frontiers is based on the seizure of free real estate, or cheap nature, and the elimination of indigenous people, or cheap lives. Industrial production then depends on ignoring the environmental cost of polluting the air, soil, and water, or cheap nature again, while also relying on the unpaid feminine labor of social reproduction, or cheap care, which helps then keep wages stagnant and drive down the cost of labor, cheap work. At the same time, the modern regime of capitalist innovation in Silicon Valley that I've just talked about is itself a phenomenon of zero interest rates policies, which meant that investors and startup founders could get drunk on all the free, easy, no strings credit sloshing around, or cheap money. All 7 of these things, all 7 of these cheap things, are important for understanding the historical and material development of capitalism. And in the context of contemporary technological capitalism, I think we need to add another thing to that list: cheap data. So now, ideally, if you are creating an AI system, you want to train it using high-quality data sets, especially if it's going to be used in socially valuable and socially consequential ways. As the old saying goes, garbage in, garbage out. And the inverse of that would then be gold standard in, gold standard out. We can define high-quality data sets as ones that are, for example, bespoke and appropriate for the purpose at hand, free of meaningful errors and harmful biases, cleaned and annotated by fairly paid workers, well documented in terms of their origins, aims, and other attributes, large and diverse enough for valuable analysis, among other widely accepted benchmarks of quality for data. Creating high-quality data sets is really good for creating great technology, but here's the problem. It's also really hard for engineers, and it's really bad for business. Choosing quality requires investing serious time and money into the production and maintenance of a vital resource. But on the other hand, if you sacrifice quality, you save a lot of time and money by acquiring tons of data using far cheaper and easier methods. In practice, this very often looks like using large data sets that already exist, even if they were made for totally different applications or have dubious origins and questionable content that can lead to obvious consequences. This is the case with many common data sets used to build machine learning models, like the ImageNet dataset, which is used for training and testing computer vision systems, which continues to be widely used even after this data set and others have been proven to be constituted by a toxic sludge of racist, sexist, homophobic, and otherwise problematic data. Such databases make for bad politics, but also for bad technologies that are built on a random assortment of weird biases and wild guesses. But their features of being quick, easy, and cheap to use are difficult to resist. Cheap data is like using mystery meat that fell off the back of a truck to feed your hungry AI models. If you are an engineer, it's just better to not know what goes into the mystery meat. And if everybody else is using the mystery meat, or better yet, if the mystery meat becomes the benchmark for quality as if it were actually the finest prosciutto, then that makes it good enough, right? Everyone else is doing it, so why not me too? As the social scientists Jenna Burrell and Marion Fourcade note in a great paper of theirs on the Society of Algorithms, quote, "A key problem is that coders and model builders rarely question the quality of the input they use." And so building models is treated as exciting, prestigious, and highly paid research. I know, I work in the faculty of IT, surrounded by people who build models for a living. Whereas cleaning data is treated as boring, low status, and poorly paid labor. I know, I work in a faculty of IT where grad students clean data for a living. This is a major contradiction of data in capitalism. Despite data being the most essential part of the whole system, it is also the most undervalued and overlooked. In other words, data has been cheapened. So, building on earlier work about cheap data from the tech critic Kelly Pendergrass, we can see how, quote, cheap data is a new kind of frontier. Rather than moving outwards, westward to the sea, into space, the cheap data frontier is an overlay positioned on top of other spheres of life in order to siphon their juices. In this way, a second resource can be extracted from the people and natures already cheapened by capital. And I think Kelly puts it really well there. So among the many social impacts of cheap data, one important consequence is that all these innovative technologies, this huge, massive industry built on this cheap data, from digital platforms to AI systems, are themselves, and I mean this as a technical term, low-quality pieces of shit. They are bullshit in the philosophical sense, coined by Harry Frankfurt, right? That is, they are completely indifferent to the truth value of their inputs and outputs. And they are enshittified in the economic sense, coined by Cory Doctorow. That is, they are degraded in ways that are actively harmful, even abusive to their users. So cheap data leads to shit technology. And that's terrible for most of us, especially those of us who, for whatever reason, have little choice but to use these systems in our lives and in our work. But it also shows that the real structural imperative motivating these innovations is not to create the most socially useful technologies, but rather to create machines that extract the most value from society. Contrary then to their cherry marketing copy, venture capitalists and corporations don't funnel their money into technologies like AI simply because they are interested in innovation for its own sake. Artificial intelligence promises to solve the problems of capital by unlocking exponential growth, eliminating labor costs, descaling workers, optimizing for efficiency, and manifesting a slew of other expected outcomes. Those same promises point us to the problems and contradictions that are inherent to these systems and the industries that build them. These troubles are more than just technical in the sense that they don't work very well. They fail to meet expectations, they are riddled with glitches, and they generate a ton of bullshit. No, they also stem from more serious issues with the cultural hype, ideological goals, financial speculation, and labor exploitation that are integral to the creation of AI by and for capital, which is to say the forms of AI that have been created in the past, present, and foreseeable future. Capitalism is a system defined by its great many contradictions, which capital then must continuously grapple with while never fully resolving or reconciling any of them. One core contradiction that is rarely remarked upon, but is crucial for understanding technology and capitalism, is the quixotic quest by capital to build what I call the perpetual value machine. In short, this would be a system for creating and capturing an infinite amount of surplus value without needing to rely on any human labor to produce that value. Capital has been pursuing this quest for hundreds of years, continually investing, innovating, hyping, failing, and trying again to reach this ultimate goal. Why? Because in addition to finally satisfying capital's endless hunger for profit, the perpetual value machine would also do so by eliminating the thing that is both the mortal enemy of capital and a vital necessity for capital, the power of labor. AI is the latest, maybe even the greatest attempt at cracking the nut of perpetual value. Much of the discourse about automation and now artificial intelligence revolves around how human labor is going to be replaced by robotic workers, with the assumption here that this is a direct replacement of organic bodies with artificial systems, both of which are supposedly doing the exact same thing, just in different ways and to different degrees. This is why every cycle of innovation comes with the same predictions. such as the headline-grabbing paper in 2013 that claimed 47% of jobs would disappear to automation within one or two decades. And this prediction never came to pass, but we give it some credit. They still have another 5 or so years to make good on it. Yet that did not stop its exact methodology from being replicated again in 2023 by another eye-catching paper, this time one co-authored by researchers at OpenAI. Their analysis focused on the impacts of large language models like ChatGPT on labor markets. And they curiously also came up with the same exact figure. Quote, between 47% and 56% of all worker tasks are susceptible to being significantly changed, if not totally replaced, by these AI systems. Both predictions were based on a method originally used to study labor market effects of companies outsourcing jobs to workers overseas, not importantly replacing them with technology. As the economic historian Aaron Benenov explains, quote, their technique, which they adapted from efforts to predict the likelihood that jobs will be offshored, that is, taken over by other human beings working overseas for lower wages, has never been successfully applied to digital technologies. And this crucial point reveals a deep-seated equivocation with humans and machines. This equivocation has long been a feature of the tech sector. For example, in the 1960s, an executive at Fairchild Semiconductor, a pioneer in manufacturing transistors and integrated circuits, described the company's key production innovation as what he called jet-age automation. And what did he mean by that? He meant offshoring the labor for assembling hardware to Hong Kong and flying its outputs back to the United States. That was jet-age automation. As Benenov's empirical research shows, tales of automation and the future of no work have long been greatly exaggerated. Now, this is not to say that technologies have no effect on the way we work, but that rather those effects are not straightforward and they don't result from those effects are not straightforward and they result from decisions made by owners and bosses about the composition of labor, what is to be done, how it's done, where it's done, and who's doing it. Put differently, a robot is never coming to your job and telling you to pack your bags. It's always a boss choosing to fire you and then using the robot as an excuse. So often the story goes something like this. Sorry, buddy, you're a valuable member of our workplace family, but this robot and that algorithm over there, which I definitely did not decide to buy and use for very specific reasons that benefit my bottom line, they're forcing me to let you go. I'm sure you understand that's just the price of progress. We hear that story told over and over and over again with every new wave of hype, every new wave of technology. But behind any form of automation, including and especially AI systems like ChatGPT and so on, are a bunch of people designing, building, using, overseeing, maintaining, repairing those systems, right? Or even taking remote control of those robots when they fail to perform their duties. If your robots can't behave enough like humans, then the next best thing is to make humans pretend to be robots. And in all cases, the technologies are vessels and conduits for human labor. The reason I call this idea of the perpetual value machine a contradiction is because the quest cannot succeed at a fundamental level. Capital's dreams of a perpetual value machine are based on a misunderstanding of the relationship between the production of value and the operation of technology. It equates one relation, humans use tools to produce value, with an entirely different one, tools produce value, with or without humans. From the perspective of capital, the problem with humans is that they are not machines. That has not stopped capitalism from quite successfully devising ways to exploit, manage, administer, and overall treat human workers like machines. And we don't even have to look hard to see these strategies expressed very clearly, very proudly. Consider these words here from Gary Becker, Nobel Prize-winning economist, often cited as one of the most influential and most highly cited social scientists of the 20th century. And Gary Becker was also a leader in applying strict forms of economic rationality to other social institutions like schools, prisons, family structures, and labor management. In a preface to the third edition of Human Capital, Gary Becker writes, quote, I hesitated a while before deciding to call my book Human Capital. In the early days, many people were criticizing this term and the underlying analysis because they believed that it treated people like slaves or machines. My, how things have changed. And so the concept of human capital, which Becker was instrumental in popularizing, has long moved past being a source of controversy. It is now common sense among everyone, from management consultants to guidance counselors, to discuss people as stocks of human capital. However, and this is important, capital continues to fail at actually turning humans into machines, or vice versa. At the same time, capital is able to approximate this metamorphosis by making humans behave more like machines, or at least forcing humans to be increasingly dependent on, even deferential to machines that are themselves extensions of capital. But the ultimate endpoint that technological capitalism is driving toward is unreachable, because it is again premised on an unresolved contradiction. I'm confident in saying that the perpetual value machine is an impossibility. Yet it is a fantasy that capital must keep alive to justify equating humans with machines. And this dream for capital is also a warning for workers. It's a warning that says you are no better than machines. You could be replaced at any time. And according to this logic, it's better to be dominated than eliminated. So we better fall in line and count our blessings. But we must also reveal this warning for what it is. An elaborate story built on contradictions, illusions, and speculation. In other words, the very foundations of so much capitalist innovation. So in concluding, I want to recall Ted Chiang's observation that most of our anxieties about technology are actually anxieties about how capitalism will use technology against us. This does not mean the technology is meaningless or somehow a red herring. Systems like AI are immensely important vectors of social power. But it does not mean that our analysis and our actions can start or stop with the technology itself. They must always be based in and directed toward a ruthless criticism of how that technology is financed, designed, and used. I've argued that a crucial way to understand those material conditions is through the concepts of innovation realism, cheap data, and the perpetual value machine. In other words, in the world we live in today, any policies for responsibly embracing the adoption of AI must also be understood as policies for expanding the dominion of capital. When bosses or governments or universities express a commitment to encourage the use of AI to innovate the way we work and live and create efficiency, this is not framed as a warning about somehow subordinating human capital to the power of machine capital. But with a bit of knowledge about political economy, the implied threat there should be obvious. So I'll leave things there. Another quick plug for my book, and I welcome any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jathan, for this incredible tour de force. So we will begin with questions right away.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It's super cool. I love seeing kind of like, research at the intersection of critiquing capitalism and AI, because there are now so many approaches to AI. I mean, there's the AI like EAC kind of people, right? Just building AI capabilities, either AGI or even just like vanilla like apps. And then there's also people who try to make AI better. That includes people who want to make AI more ethical by working, inside Google, Facebook, and eventually maybe they get fired or the boss doesn't really want to do that and stuff like that. And then there's, this other approach, like effective altruism, AI safety. They try to do it from the outside, although these days they also have entered OpenAI, Anthropic. I mean, they founded Anthropic and DC. So it's both kind of outside and inside and spreading to academia too. But yeah, it seems like none of these approaches are enough because all those people, either you make AI a little bit more ethical from within the companies, or EAs, effective altruists, they are fundamentally, pro-capitalism and fundamentally techno-optimists, except that they believe AI can kill us. That's the difference between them and the actual techno-optimists like Mark Andreessen, right? Otherwise, they're pretty much the same. I was in that world for a long time. So I'm very excited to see your stuff from more I don't know, communist or anti-capitalist perspective. And definitely want to read your book. Definitely, I don't know if this talk is on YouTube. I want to send to my AI bros. But sorry, my actual question is, I think, no, it's really great to see the critique. I just wonder if you had any thoughts. I know your focus is on critique, not like solutions, but any thoughts on how to solve it? Because my friends, some of them work on AI ethics, and one of them would say, look, this AI safety approach from effective altruism is not going to lead to anything good. The real approach is I think the AI ethics community, I'm not in it, but my friend told me they are thinking more about developing AI in a completely different approach. That's not like capitalistic, these like OpenAI or VC anything, but participatory. And I think that's great. I think that's what should happen, instead of either working with an OpenAI or outside to make it better, AI alignment, effective altruism stuff. But how would that happen? How would that approach happen within capitalism is I don't know, because VCs, they're so powerful. And now US government, Trump try to build his own. So what are your thoughts? Obviously, we want to dismantle capitalism, but I don't know when that's going to happen. And AI, some of my friends in AI safety, they believe that AGI is coming 1 year, 2 year, 5 years. I don't know if they're right, but if AI, power of coming so fast, capitalism is still here.
Let me pick up on a number of things that you've laid down there. So no, I really appreciate the question, and you've raised a lot of concerns. I mean, I think, right, if we get to the heart there, which I think is a very common response to any critique, especially a ruthless one, is, well, what's your ruthless solution, right? and so, well, and I mean, I think, right, the book here is really oriented around these two role models, these two archetypes, two sides of the same coin for what I think a ruthless criticism of technology and capitalism demands, which is the mechanic and the Luddite, right? The mechanic is about understanding the operations of the machine, how it actually works, what it does, right? Having a real kind of getting your hands greasy and in the machine itself, how does it work? The Luddite then adds that social, that kind of normative aspect to it. Not just understanding how the machine works, which we should note that the original Luddites were themselves mechanics, artisans, highly technical people. But it was also about understanding who the machine works for, right? What work it does in society, and this questioning if a machine should exist or not, right? And I think that we're really at this radical point, and Marion mentioned it when she introduced me, that the kind of this politics of refusal, which is a really core part of, I think, the normative guidance and the normative edge of the book, which is really holding up any piece of technology and questioning, should you exist? And in a way, it's almost like doing zero-based budgeting, which is what Elon Musk does in his companies and is now doing in the government, which is you slash a budget to zero, and then any dollars added to that budget must be argued for, right? So rather than arguing for cuts, you argue for adding adding to zero, which is a very ruthless way of doing budgeting, and it cuts you to the bone. I think technology deserves to be zero-based budgeted, right? You refuse all of it, and then you have to argue why any piece of technology deserves to exist, right? It's the Marie Kondo principle. You hold it up. Does this spark joy? Does it add to societal welfare or social benefit? And so, if not, throw it away. But right now, we take the exact opposite approach, which is the bias is toward adding strata and strata, layers and layers of technology, systems, innovations on top of each other, right? Never arguing that anything shouldn't exist, but always the bias towards everything must exist, right? And so to me, that solution, what's the solution here then, is to take seriously no. as a response, right? If you can't say no to something, then then it's not really a choice, right? If no's not on the table, then you have no ability to consent or to deny, to reject. It's not a choice. And right now we see a lot of the material and ideological structures around technology and capitalism is about taking no off the table as a choice, right? Just acquiesce, accept, or embrace it. And so I think we can go a very long way by putting no on the table, by making any technology have to be ruthlessly argued for rather than having to be argued against, right? So I think I'll leave things there, but that's very much a normative guidance in the book.
But isn't that exactly what the Luddites did? Is they've basically said no, and then society decided that the lower cost of textiles overrode their no and voted again and again through their purchasing decisions to go with more automated forms of textile production.
It wasn't society, and this is important. The original Luddites were a really perfect example of industrial capital and state power first coming together to bolster each other. So when the Luddites said no, it was actually society and the community. If we think of society as the communities around these technologies, the people that make up social relations and groups, the Luddites were folk heroes. People loved them. They largely supported the Luddite movement and what it stood for. The people who said no were industrial capital in the form of bosses and owners who owned the factories, who owned the machines, and the state in the form of a mad king and his military, right? And it was one of the first examples of industrial capital lobbying the state to say, use your monopoly on violence to suppress the workers who are rising up against us. This was also a time when England was battling a fierce war against Napoleon. But England sent more soldiers to the north to suppress worker uprisings known as the Luddites than they did to the front to fight Napoleon. So England knew what battle actually mattered more, which was the battle to support capital against these workers who are trying to say no. And it was then that frame breaking or machine breaking was made a treasonous act against the state, punishable by hanging. So what we see here then is this melding of capital and the state. And that's important. That's an important aspect here. It's what we're seeing right now with the Trump administration is tech capital and the state merging together, right? And what's important here is to understand that capital depends on the state to take no off the table. And then to tell stories about actually everybody loved it. Everybody agreed. Everyone was like, capital is amazing. I love industrial capital. I love the factories that, force children to work to the bone and feed them into the machine and so on, right? So you get the story that it was actually a consenting process all along. But in reality, getting to that real material condition, how is this happening? We see that it's a long process of using violence, the violence of the economy or the violence of the state to take away people's ability to say no and then convince them after the fact that they actually said yes the whole time.
Just a quick corollary to that. I've heard like the counterexample of where the state supports the artisan in the case of like Arabic calligraphers versus the printing press. And, Europe embraced the printing press, and you had the dissemination of information that was so much cheaper because of it. And then you had like some argument that there was stagnation in Arabic cultures because information was kept by a few calligraphers who could, write books and manuscripts and disseminate them through a much more limited means. So that's a case where the state intervened to support the artisans, slowing down what I think most people would see as like useful dissemination of information, both state-sponsored, but one for the new technology, one against.
I think that story would be news to a lot of historians of Arab culture in the Middle East, right? Which is largely seen as a golden age of culture and scientific advancement, and largely until like the 60s and 70s, right? You look at pictures of Baghdad or look at pictures of Tehran, up until the mid 1900s, looks amazing, right? It is at the forefront of fashion, of culture, of science. What happened? Fossil fuel capital and Western hegemony stepped in and said, actually, we need the things that you're kind of sitting on top of, right? And so again, that story of stagnation because one embraced the printing press and one embraced calligraphy or protected calligraphy, that's a technological deterministic story, but it's also a post hoc story, right? It's a story told after the fact to explain in very abstracted and simplified ways complex social, political, and economic processes, right? And I think that's the thing that I started to talk with, is the problem comes when we fetishize technology, when we use it as a theory, as a way to explain phenomenon, rather than understanding it as the product of more complex social processes, right? So, but I think there's lots of other questions. Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. I'm sort of curious about I think this narrative which comes up in the talk that these AI companies offer, which is that the production of AI systems creates so many negative externalities, right? The sort of redirecting of water from drinking sources to cool down the GPUs that get very hot, building all of these data centers around the world. But that society should accept these negative externalities because this like hypothetical system that they create, this AGI system, is going to solve so many problems, including the very ones that were created for these for this production. And it's sort of framed as a societal good. This Project Stargate idea is so bizarre to me that it needs, public investment to produce these things when there's already so much private money flowing into it. But, a lot of this is premised on the idea that sort of bigger is better, that bigger models, bigger, more data, pouring more and more things into this is sort of better or important for these. And I thought a few days ago there was a kind of interesting counterexample to this with this model, DeepSeek model, which is sort of much smaller. And there was a weird moment where I was like, oh my gosh, this narrative that Silicon Valley is sort of promoting seems to have a kind of contradiction in a way that is not just being heard by academics and people who don't already believe it, but kind of society more at large. Do you see that as a sort of contradiction? Do you sort of see this kind of moment as one in which there is a lot of potential for challenging this narrative? Or do you think that there is it is sort of still entrenched and inframed by the kind of neoliberal logics of that are so dominant in the world, and that this isn't really a kind of big deal?
Yeah, the question of DeepSeek, right? So for people who don't know what that is, it was a Chinese large language model produced by a quant hedge fund in China that very quickly and suddenly rocketed up to #1 on the App Store, right? But the thing, overtaking ChatGPT's, dominance of the AI LLM market. But the thing that really got a lot of people scared. Mark Andreessen saying this is Silicon Valley Sputnik moment is DeepSeek. And the thing that got people scared was the way that DeepSeek fundamentally challenges what we assume were the foundational axioms of the economics for AI, right? Which is that it requires massive hyperscale investment into these very resource intense, capital intensive infrastructures that you can only build these, ChatGPT or rather GPT-4, OpenAI says they spent $100 million just training that model, not the money needed to build it, develop it, test it, and then operate it, just $100 million on the training alone, right? It's this idea that AI is this thing that can only be done at the highest echelons of capital in the state, right? Because it requires so much money, so much resource, land, water, energy, right? Things that are testing the bounds of our grid and our existing infrastructure. And then DeepSeek comes along, and according to the company that built it, they only spent $5.5 million training it, as opposed to $100 million. We don't know how much they spent building it and so on. But there's reports that you can run the model not on gold-plated server farms in Mesa, Arizona, but like on a moderately powerful MacBook Pro, with an M1 chip. So it questions these technological and economic kind of axioms of what we know AI requires. It's so much more efficient, it's so much cheaper, and so on. So then the question is, what does that mean for the industry? How does that challenge the industry, and does it solve the business model? I talked about in the presentation, the Goldman Sachs report and so on, that AI is a technology still looking desperately for a business model. It needs a business. It doesn't make money. It loses, it hemorrhages money, and it needs a business model, right? So then the question is, does DeepSeek change any of that? The response by Silicon Valley is not to do what we think they might do if they adhered to their values, which was to see a technologically superior process and say, oh my God, we were wrong the whole time. And because we value optimization and we value elegance and we value doing things in the best way possible, the best technical way possible, we must reorganize the way that we understand AI, the way that we organize the investment around it, what the technology even means. That was not the response. The response was Mark Zuckerberg saying, we're investing $60 billion this year alone into AI development, right? It was Masayoshi's son, the lead of SoftBank, saying, I'm investing $25 billion into OpenAI to have the largest equity stake and value it as a $300 billion company, right? The response, in other words, was to double down and say, actually, DeepSeek doesn't disprove anything. Scale is still king. And what that means to me, and I think about the work that Alex Hanna at DARE and some of her colleagues wrote a great paper a couple years ago around the politics of scale in AI. And to me, what that means as well is that scale is how modes of capital cement their domination, right? We see this if we look at our friends in geography. We can see this across, whether it's the railroads, a mode of capital built around logistics, cemented its domination through massive overinvestment into railroads, into canals, into logistical infrastructure, right? Because it puts a concrete flag in the planet itself and says, we own this. You have to pass through us if you want to do anything, right? We can see the similar kinds of things happening in finance, right? Massive overinvestment and overaccumulation into complex financial instruments, ways of reorganizing institutions and governments around assetization and securitization and forms of esoteric expertise. And that's a way for capital to cement its domination and say, we own this. If you want to do anything, you have to go through us. And that's what we see right now with technology capital. It's massive overinvestment and overaccumulation in infrastructure, hardware, and software as a way to plant a flag in the economy and society and people's lives and say, we own this. If you want to do anything, you have to go through us. And so there's a commitment to scale, because that commitment to scale is a commitment to cementing the material power of that mode of capital. And so something like DeepSeek, rather than challenging that commitment, makes them double down on that commitment as a way to bury it, right? And I think it will happen. I think DeepSeek is not going to be Silicon Valley Sputnik moment. I think the thing that comes out of DeepSeek, because it also doesn't solve the business model problem for AI. I think what we will see is that in a few years, it's not going to be, we are all now dominated by the Chinese LLM market and OpenAI and Anthropic are gone. I think it will instead be another titan to the pantheon, right? Instead of talking about ChatGPT and Anthropic, we'll talk about ChatGPT, Anthropic, and DeepSeek, right? Just adding another name to the pantheon, because there's too much at stake to let this one little model from China usurp everything that Silicon Valley is investing in and committed to.
Thanks for the talk. I've just got a question with a minor preamble. So I'm sort of curious about your arguments around the idea of fetishization of technology and not understanding it as a series of social processes. And that calls to mind scholars like Rayvon Fouché, who argue that it's actually within the question of productivity that technology becomes capitalistic. It's not technology itself so much as the will towards productivity. And we see those arguments in early land grabs in the US, in Australia, et cetera. And so I'm sort of just wondering about then the conceptualization of AI as a system rather than process, or a series of processes. And others have argued also that scale itself is also process. And it's not that the AI system itself is inefficient. The AI system doesn't exist without the processes that keep it running. So the GPUs, the algorithms, and I've spent, let's say, the last 4 years running these algorithms and critiquing them. And I think I wonder to what degree that actually reifies that fetishization of the technological object, the system, AI, rather than actually seeing it as a loose collection of, convolutional neural networks or whatever that are having to constantly be kept up and run. And to that end, my kind of question is fairly simple, which is taking that into account, why is cheap data not just cheap labor or worse, cheap care? Because again, as someone who manages data sets, it's the labor. So ImageNet, for instance, was photography from cheap photography. It was, and so like in making it cheap data, don't we then also risk that abstraction? And the same way that like data curators, like that is a care form, taking care to produce us. And I think a lot of the early internet data was care, in a way sharing. A lot of the code that's been placed on places like GitHub and Stack Exchange that are now used to get people out the job, that it was data that was shared freely. And so I'm just sort of interested, why is cheap data its whole new category rather than just an extension of cheap labor or cheap care?
I mean, two really great questions. So about systems and processes, and about data and labor, care, and so on. So why systems instead of processes? Why data instead? Two great questions that I think are interconnected as well. And what I would say is that you're dead on. And for me, it's because I think relationally. When I think of systems, I don't think of something that like a snapshot that is like a static thing captured in a particular space and time, right? But I think of things that are dynamic and processual in themselves, right? Systems don't exist as these kind of static things, right? They exist as things that are dynamic or changing or interacting. That to me is the system aspect here as well. It's about thinking relationally. I agree, we shouldn't think of a system as just a machine learning model or a convolutional neural network, or as a laptop connected to Wi-Fi or whatever. We have to think of systems as these relational networks of the technology, yes, but also the economic interests, the financing, the labor, the politics, all of those other things I talked about. So when I think about systems, I think about them, in STS called socio-technical systems, right? But I think that also risk reifying because it creates a boundary where it's like, well, we have to live in the hyphen between socio and technical, right? It's not this thing, an abstracted social system meets an abstracted technical system, and then we're looking at a thing that emerges from that. But it is about living in that hyphen, understanding that these things don't exist without being interconnected and in relations with lots of other things. But also trying to have a precise analysis of, on one hand, trying to look at a big like morass of stuff, while also trying to tease out, okay, what's the different stuff in that stuff, And so when we think about like these I think really useful analytical distinctions between like data, labor, care, and so on, it's again, I think a bad analysis would be to say that these things exist independently of each other, right? And in my examples I gave, I tried to link multiple together quite purposefully to show that these things don't exist as independently of each other, right? If anything, if we think in Marxist terms about it, right, it's trying to do like value form theory, right? Like what form is value taking at that time, and how does value circulate in different ways and take on different forms. It wears different masks or takes on different embodiments or different purposes, right? So when we think about like, you know, the capital circulation of money becomes a commodity, which then becomes more money, money prime, right? Like those are abstractions for thinking about like a dynamic circulation of money. You know, Marx calls capital value in motion. That's how he defines it, right? And I think the in motion is a really crucial part of that. So when we think about data, and the reason why I pull it out, I think the reason why people like Kelly Pendergrass pull it out in their work as well, is we're thinking about how capital is thinking about value in different ways, right? How capital is thinking about value as something that is materialized in this thing we call data. But of course, that only comes out of its relationship to other forms of capital, other circuits of capital, the circulation there, right? And that is, you know, you don't get data without labor, without care, without nature, you know, without all these other kinds of things, these other forms of value. And I talk about this a lot in my work, right? Like my concept of Potemkin AI is about looking at AI and saying, if you tear the Scooby-Doo mask off AI, it was labor the whole time, you know. But I think that concept resonates with people because it's about seeing how one thing is fetishized as being disconnected from these other value forms, these other circulations of capital. But in reality, it was always labor the whole time. And we can say the same thing about data, right? It was always data, or it was always labor the whole time. It's always care the whole time. But I think importantly, with data and the work I argue around data capital, right? Technological capitalism sees data as a crucial form of capital. It treats it as such. It's governed by the kinds of imperatives of capital accumulation, of constant circulation, of dynamic renewal, of relations with other forms of value. And that, to me, is the reason why I pull out data and cheap data as an analytical kind of vessel or box that we can look at, because it's important to capital today. And it's important then, if we want to understand how capital works, why capital does the things that it does, it's important to see that data and its relationship to data is a really important part of that. But of course, it's not a static snapshot in time, nor is it disconnected from these other value forms. So yeah, thank you.
Oh, hello. Thanks for the clear talk. I appreciate what you said about putting no on the table and the idea of like trying to assert social control over technology. But of course, someone, as Marxists we know, someone has to put no on the table. So I guess I'm curious, to me, like one of the vital questions would be like, even if it's not going to automate all work, how is this change in the composition of capital going to change the composition of labor, and then as a result change the terrain of the class struggle, which is what is the only thing that's going to get any of this fixed. So
it's a great question, and I would point to the brilliant work of Brian Merchant, our dear friend who wrote Blood in the Machine, an excellent history of Luddism, but is also himself doing a ton of great reporting on the front lines of different class struggles against AI, right? That, the Writers Guild of America, SAG-AFTRA, right? These other, the animators, right? He's done a lot of work, in the video game industry, right? Going to these places that are where labor unions are treating AI as an issue that labor needs to take seriously, right? And it is, right? Like you see them putting no on the table. In response to, in this example, like the big studios or the big, AAA video game companies, right, that want to push through AI, push through these requirements around, using AI in the workflow process, using the products of people's labor to then train the AI that's going to replace them, and so on and so forth. And you see there people saying, no, right? Like this is a point that we're going to actually organize like big strikes around. We're going to take as like a live issue. And to me, that the story of the Luddites, and it's a story that Brian tells really well in his book too, was that picking up the hammer and smashing the machine was not the first option, but it was the option of last resort, right? Like it was the result of first people understanding, as the historian David Noble did, understanding technology in the present tense, understanding what the technology means materially right now for people's lives and society. So having a ruthless criticism of it, right? And then from that, going through the processes, trying to negotiate, saying, all right, I see you, capital, want to use this technology in this way, but we don't want that because it harms us in these ways. So can we reach a negotiation point? They were stonewalled at that point, right? All right, well, now we need to go, we'll do a big petition. We'll get a bunch of other people in the community and in the society and maybe even politicians and so on to support our cause, right? How can we, have a kind of a social response to this? That they were stonewalled there as well, right? And so you go through every one of these phases. It was only then when they were denied at every single turn all of the normal channels of challenging something, of trying to have your voice and your value represented, right? It was only when all of those failed that they said, you've left us no choice but to organize together and under cover of night, smash the machines, specifically the machines of factory owners who were known to use child labor, to speed up the process of work, to degrade the quality of that work, leaving some machines in ruin while leaving machines right next to them owned by other bosses that were known to treat their workers well and so on, leaving those machines untouched, right? So it was very targeted in that way. And so I think, in the response of like, what do we do? How do we stand up against this? How do I like grab a hammer and smash the data servers, right? I think what we have to realize is we're only at that point. And I think I hope my book contributes to it. We're still at that point of the ruthless criticism, right? How do we understand these things as in the present tense, right? How do we understand them as these products of these relationships, these forms of social power and financial value and so on? And then what do we do from there? How do we organize? How do we petition? How do we negotiate? We haven't exhausted all of those possibilities, all those options available to us yet. So we're not even at the point yet where it's like, well, I guess we got no choice but to grab the hammer and start, finding computers and smashing them. We're not at that point yet because we haven't even exhausted all of the like normal, legitimate channels for social and political resistance. And so I think this, my book, Brian Merchant's book, the work of people that are focused on these topics, I think right now what we're trying to do is catalyze people to think about technology in this way and then start saying, you have a lot of options on the table before you get to the Luddite option, right? And we have to start exhausting those options.
It's on now. So to that end, I have a question about systemic risk. So I was really struck by how you were talking about AI being trained on mystery meat. And it brought to mind the mortgage crisis, right? And the ways in which the systemic risk posed by mystery meat, in that case, garbage mortgages, and the ways in which we underestimated the risk of that particular mystery meat, right? And the systemic risk that it posed, nearly bringing down the financial sector, dispossessing millions of people, et cetera. I'm wondering how we should be thinking about the systemic risk of AI. Is AI materially integrated far enough into our society to pose the same kinds of risks that that garbage mortgages did? So how are you kind of thinking about systemic risk in that way? I'm thinking particularly economic risk, but feel free to interpret it broadly.
I think that's great, and I think it's a really apt comparison there to make as well, because I think in short, like, yes, there's very clearly a lot of systemic risk posed by these AI systems that we know are disconnected from things like truth value, right? Or like material grounding in reality. We know as well that there have been a number of studies by consultancies like Deloitte and Accenture, which are on one hand on the front line of pushing these systems and saying, you know, every industry needs to reorganize its workflow and its business model around using AI. But on the other hand, these same consultancies routinely publish results of studies that show, well, you know, it actually causes a lot more work and less value for the industries that, for a lot of industries that try to shoehorn these technologies into their workflow, right? Using what the Bloomberg columnist Matt Levine aptly called, you know, years ago when ChatGPT was first released, is we should understand it as an overly eager intern. Right? That's about the level that it operates at, right? It's an intern that's really eager to please you and to do what you ask it to do. And sometimes it doesn't do it in the best way or in a way that is accurate, but it will do what you ask it to do in a very eager and enthusiastic way. And you should treat it like you would treat an overly eager intern, right? The problem is we treat it like we do, you know, philosophers and strategists and, you know, all these other kind of, you know, the leaders of society. And so that alone, I think, poses a lot of systemic risk. You know, what happens when these systems start to fail in both predicted and unpredictable ways, but they are now integrated across industries. I mean, I think, fortunately for us, we're still at that point of, you know, how deeply and widely are they going to be integrated? I mean, with everything that's happening now with Doge and so on, it seems quite deeply and quite widely. So I think your question around the systemic risk that they pose, and, you know, do we end up with, instead of a lot of, you know, toxic securities, we have, you know, toxic systems that no one really knows how they work, what's inside of them. So in a lot of ways, a ton of analogies with the subprime mortgage bubble, right? And so the question there is, I think, what happens when that systemic risk, when the cash comes, you know, when we have to cash the check on that systemic risk. But I think the problem here is that not enough people are thinking about that systemic risk in real material terms. They're thinking about it in real immaterial and ideological terms. In other words, existential risk, right? What happens when AI eliminates human civilization or whatever it might be? Things that will not come to pass. But what might come to pass is a much weirder and maybe larger version of the 2008 financial crash.
Actually, we're running out of time. And just to close on this topic, because I cannot resist, there was a little release of a question that Anthropic is posing to its applicants. I don't know if you've seen it. So the question is, why do you want to work at Anthropic? And then the subtext is, while we encourage people to use AI systems during their role to help them work faster and more effectively, please do not use AI assistants during the application process. We want to understand your personal interest in Anthropic without mediation through an AI system, and we also want to evaluate your non-AI assisted communication skills. So, you know, otherwise what we end up with is sort of garbage that doesn't say anything. So thank you so much for a really enlightening presentation. And if anyone has more questions, you can always come to the front and ask them. Thank you, Jathan, for being here.
Thank you.